The Far East encompasses some of my favorite mythology. Today we're going to be looking at two very specific creation myths from China and Japan, but the mythology from this area is widely versed, and we see some very beautiful myths from India and Indonesia and Mongolia and Myanmar. But today we're just going to be looking at Chinese and Japanese myths of creation. Today we'll be looking at the myths of Pangu and Nuwa from China and the origin of Japan and her people from Japan. Pangu is one of the originating cosmic gods of the Chinese cosmogony, and Nuwa is the human creator in Chinese cosmogony. And then when we get to Japan, we'll be looking at two primordial parents named Izanagi and Izanami. Chinese mythology is a mixture of history, legend, and myth. Great Chinese emperors are often incorporated into the mythology of the area, and we won't maybe see this so much with the creation cosmogonies, but definitely in the flood mythologies, we'll encounter Yu the Great and his incorporation into the Chinese dynasty. These myths are made up of early Confucian works, late 4th century BCE poems of the Huyan, Taoist philosophy, and Chinese Buddhist philosophies. Today we'll look at the myth of Pangu, and Pangu's myth is fairly simple. I'm going to read it to you. Long, long ago, when heaven and earth were still one, the entire universe was contained in an egg-shaped cloud. All the matter of the universe swirled chaotically in that egg. Deep within the swirling matter was Pangu, a huge giant, who grew in the chaos for 18,000 years. He developed and slept in the egg. Finally, one day he awoke and stretched, and the egg broke to release the matter of the universe. The lighter, purer elements drifted upwards to make the sky and heavens, and the heavier, impure elements settled downwards to make the earth. In the midst of the new world, Pangu worried that heaven and earth might mix again. So he resolved to hold them apart, with the heavens on his head and the earth under his feet. As the two continued to separate, Pangu grew to hold them apart. For 18,000 years, he continued to grow until the heavens were 30,000 miles above the earth. For much longer he continued to hold the two apart, fearing the return of the chaos of his youth. Finally, he realized they were stable, and soon after that, Pangu died. With the immense giant's death, the earth took on a new character. His arms and legs became the four directions and the mountains. His blood became the rivers, and his sweat became the rain and dew. His voice became the thunder, and his breath became the winds. His hair became the grass, and his veins became the roads and paths. His teeth and bones became the minerals and rocks, and his flesh became the soil of the fields. Up above, his left eye became the sun, and his right eye became the moon. Thus in death, as in life, Pangu made the world as it is today. Many centuries later, there was another goddess that we're going to be looking at named Nuwa. Pangu is important because he's a symbol of good and evil. His separation of the dark and the light are associated with the yin and yang. He is the first living creature in creation mythology from China, and his body becomes the world much like we see in ancient Egyptian mythology with Tiamat. Myths of Pangu often include legendary mythical creatures and the turtle. As the turtle appears in many myths, you'll see more about the turtle in Chinese mythology when we get to the flood section. But I want you to be aware that these mythical creatures come about in these early creation stories, and then they are written about later in other myths involving these peoples. Many centuries after the death of Pangu, Nuwa roamed this wild world that Pangu had left behind, and she became lonely in her solitude. Stopping by the pond to rest, she saw her reflection and realized that there was nothing like herself in the world. She resolved to make something like herself for company. From the edge of the pond, she took some mud and shaped it in the form of a human being. At first her creation was lifeless, and she set it down. It took life as soon as it touched the soil. However, and soon the human was dancing and celebrating its new life. Pleased with her creation, Nuwa made more of them, and soon her loneliness disappeared in the crowd of little humans around her. For 2 days she made them, and still she wanted to make more. Finally, she pulled down a long vine and dragged it through the mud, and then she swung the vine through the air. Droplets of the mud flew everywhere. When they fell, they became more humans that were nearly as perfect as the ones she had made by hand. Soon she had spread humans all over the whole world. The ones she made by hand became the aristocrats, and the ones she made with the vine became the poorer common people. Even then, Nuwa realized her work was incomplete because her creations died. She would have to make more. She solved this problem by dividing the humans into male and female so they could reproduce and save her from having to make new humans to break her solitude. Many years later, Pangu's greatest fear comes true, and the heavens collapsed, so there were holes in the sky, and the earth cracked, letting water rush in from below to flood the earth. At other places, fire springs forth from the earth, and everywhere wild beasts emerged from the forest to prey on the people. Nuwa drove the beasts back and healed the earth to fix the sky. She took the stones of many colors from the river and built a fire in which she melted them. She used the molten rock to patch the holes in the sky, and she used the 4 legs of a giant turtle to support the sky again. Exhausted by her labors, she soon laid down to die, and like Pangu, from her body came many more creatures to adorn the world around us. So who was Nuwa? She's considered the mother goddess of Chinese cosmogony. She was a sister wife of the August emperor god Fuji, a serpent figure capable of shape-shifting, a creator of the first humans, and she was also a pretty awesome ruler. She was able to fix the sky after Pangu had died, and ingeniously she turned that turtle upside down and used his 4 legs to prop the heavens and earth apart again. The turtle again shows up in the mythology. I really love this myth. The depictions that you're seeing of Nuwa are from a children's book. Um, and I think it's a really lovely children's book. One interesting thing about Nuwa's creation is they create a class system or an aristocracy that is put in place and used all over China. This aristocracy is simply based in humans that were handcrafted and humans that were dropped out of mud. And these poorer, not as well crafted humans become associated with the poorer common people, while the handcrafted, painstakingly crafted clay figures from the first 2 days become the aristocrats. And Nuwa spreads these aristocrats all over the earth, as well as the common people or the lower class citizens. Now I'd like to take a look at Japanese mythology, if we could. And Japanese mythology is made up of early pre-Buddhist and Shinto mythology. Much of the pre-Buddhist mythology comes from Japanese shamanism, and Shintoism is a polytheistic system that expresses the Japanese worldview. So who were Izanagi and Izanami? They are the primordial parents of Japanese culture. Izanagi and Izanami conjure ideas of the yin and yang again, the dark and light. And Izanagi's thrusting of the spear into the waters forming the island of Japan is symbolic of the primordial parent's creation, or the actual penetration of the sex act that would create more people. Anytime you see a thrusting of a spear or a stick or something phallic looking into water, it generally represents some sort of sexual act or creation in literature. The origin of Japan and her people. When heaven and earth began, three deities came into being: the spirit master of the center of heaven, the august wondrously producing spirit, and the divine wondrously producing ancestor. These three were invisible. The earth was young then, and land floated like oil, and from it reed shoots sprouted. From these reeds came two more deities. After them, 5 or 6 pairs of deities came into being, and the last of these were Izanagi and Izanami, whose names mean the male who invites and the female who invites. The first 5 deities commanded Izanagi and Izanami to make and solidify the land of Japan, and they gave the young pair a jeweled spear. Standing on the floating bridge of heaven, they dipped it in the ocean brine and stirred. They pulled out the spear, and the brine that dripped off of it formed an island to which they descended. On this island they built a palace for their wedding, and a great column to the heavens. Izanami examined her body and found that in one place it had not grown, and she told this to Izanagi, who replied that his body was well formed, but that one place had grown to excess. He proposed that he place his excess in her place that was not complete, and in doing that they would make new land. So they agreed to walk around the pillar and meet behind it to do this. When they arrived behind the pillar, she greeted him by saying, "What a fine young man!" and he responded by greeting her with, "What a fine young woman!" They procreated and gave birth to a leech-like child, which they put in a basket and let float down the river. Then they gave birth to a floating island, which likewise they did not recognize as one of their children. Disappointed by their failures in procreation, they returned to the heavens and consulted the deities there, and the deities explained that the cause of their difficulties was that the female had spoken first when they met to procreate. Izanagi and Izanami returned to their island and again met behind the heavenly pillar. When they met, he said, "What a fine young woman," and she said, "What a fine young man." They mated and gave birth to a variety of deities to inhabit those islands, including the sea deity and the deity of the sea straits, the deities of rivers, winds, trees, and mountains. Last, Izanami gave birth to a fire deity, and her genitals were burned very badly and she died. Izanagi grieved over Izanami, and a deity was born from his tears. Distraught after burying Izanami, he used his long sword to behead his son, the fire deity, whose birth had killed Izanami. From the blood on the sword came 3 deities of rocks, 2 deities of fire, and 1 of water, all of which are needed to make a sword. 8 more deities arose from the body of Izanagi and Izanami's slain son. Izanagi still longed for Izanami, and he went to the underworld in search of her. Finding her in darkness, he called to her and asked her to come back to the land of the living with him. She promised that she would go ask the gods of the underworld, but she begged him not to look at her as she did so. She was gone long, however, when eventually he broke off the end of his hair comb and set it afire for a light. He found her body with maggots consuming it, and these maggots were the 8 deities of thunder. Ashamed to be seen in this condition, Izanami chased Izanagi and pursued him. At last she grasped a huge rock and used it to close the passage to the underworld. Enraged, she shouted to him that she would each day strangle 1,000 people of Japan, and he responded that if she did so each day he would cause 1,500 Japanese people to be born. This is why 1,500 children are born each day and 1,000 people die each day in Japan. Izanagi returned to his home and he bathed to purify himself after this terrible experience. As he disrobed, new deities arose from his clothing, and more arose from the water as he bathed. 3 of these were the ancestors of the Japanese families: The last of these deities was a son, Susanswo, who became the deity of the sea, and he was eventually exiled to earth for his behavior in the heavens. But he and his sister, the goddess of sun, parented 8 deities. Among these was the ancestor of the Yamato family that ruled Japan, and 2 others were ancestors of the 19 highest families. When the deities had pacified the land, the goddess of the sun dispatched Japan's first ruler from the heavens to the earth. Descending from a floating bridge of heaven to the mountain tops, he built his palace. Eventually, he met a beautiful young woman, Princess Brilliant Blossoms, and he asked her to marry him. She deferred to her father's judgment, and her father gave him both Princess Brilliant Blossoms and her older sister, Princess Long as Rocks. The new emperor refused the older sister, however, because of her ugliness. When the father heard this, he explained that he had offered Princess Long as Rocks because her children would have lived eternally. Instead, the children of Princess Brilliant Blossoms, they were mortal, which is why the emperors have never had long lives. Princess Brilliant Blossoms was soon with child, and soon the emperor could hardly believe that she bore his children. To prove herself, she built a palace and shut herself in and set fire to it. Knowing as he did that the children of any one but the emperor could not survive the flames. Amidst the flames, she gave birth to 3 deities, and ultimately their descendants become the imperial family of Japan. Izanagi and Izanami set in place some beautiful rituals that we don't really think about a whole lot in our current religion. The ritual of bathing. After Izanagi encounters Izanami in the underworld and sees her, he comes back to earth and bathes to purify himself, which is the act of baptism. And it becomes part of a religion, or part of their religion and tradition. Other things that we see in this tale are depictions of the underworld and decomposition of bodies. We don't really get to see that view in other myths because the gods arise or the gods are immortal. But here we see an idea of decomposition, which kind of informs humans what decay of a body looks like. We also see the bridge, the rainbow bridge from the heavens, which we see in the Norse traditions. There are many similarities all across mythology. And what I really want you to see is how these creation myths are similar. Because really, all people are very similar, no matter where they're from. And if you had been born in a different place, you may believe one of these things instead of the book that you choose to believe.